Good evening. My name is Peter Casarella, professor in the Divinity School and executive director of Fons Vitae, the new Catholic initiative at Duke. I want to welcome you here tonight for our very distinguished lecture for a very special event for us. First, a number of words of gratitude have to be briefly communicated, very important. Troy Cassian and Samantha Hernandez from Fons Vitae have been working very hard to set this up. We also have some benefactors. We're working together with the In Lumine Network and the Lumen Christi Institute at the University of Chicago. The Transformative Ideas program here at Duke has helped us out. The historical division here in Duke Divinity, a little known powerhouse within Duke Divinity, has also been essential in allowing this to happen. And of course, the funding from the John Templeton Foundation, whose grant, the In Lumine, supporting the Catholic intellectual tradition on campuses nationwide, made all of this possible. Tonight's lecturer is a distinguished scholar, Peter Harrison, Professor Emeritus of History and Philosophy at the University of Queensland and Professorial Research Fellow at the University of Notre Dame, Australia. Professor Harrison has published extensively in the area of intellectual history with a focus on the philosophical, scientific, and religious thought of the early modern period, and has written more generally on the historical relation between science and religion, which is a special interest, not only the In Lumine Network, but I know many of you are here to listen to what he has to say about that. His 12 books include The Territories of Science and Religion from the University of Chicago Press in 2015, and most recently, Some New World, Myths of Supernatural Belief in a Secular Age with Cambridge University Press just this year. He's been a distinguished lecturer for Bampton Lectures, Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh in 2010, 2011. We're very, very privileged to have us with us tonight. Peter Harrison, please join me in welcoming him to Duke.
Thanks, Peter, for that very generous welcome. And I'd also like to thank, well, all of the people you thanked, actually, for making this possible. And thank you for coming. It's great to see you all here. And particular thanks to Troy. He's been terrific with the logistics and making sure I get here on time, fed and watered. So we're going to talk about religious origins of modern science, ? And we're going to talk about that topic under these particular heads. I want to start just by talking very generally about some of the ways in which historians approach the issue of historical causation. How do we know that certain movements, ideas, have a historical impact? How do we test that hypothesis? Then I'm going to talk about a number of the ways in which religious considerations had an impact on the emergence of science in the 17th century, Western science. And I'm going to talk about the motivations of the key actors, the presuppositions that make modern science distinctive and possible, how religion had an impact on the distinctive methods, the experimental methods in particular, that characterize science. And then something on this broad question of social and moral legitimation, which may not be clear immediately what I'm talking about there, but hopefully by the end of the lecture, that will be clear. And then I'm going to say something a little bit about, given my thesis that religion played a significant and positive role in the emergence of modern science, how is it that we have a very common popular view that science-religion relations historically have been characterised by perennial conflict? Where does that story come from if it's in contradiction to the actual history? So I'm going to talk first of all then about this question of historical explanation and how it is that we can arrive at the idea that religion, or Christianity in particular, had something to do with the rise of modern science. Now, as historians, we can't tie this down in the laboratory and work out which of the relevant variables has done the causal work. We can't identify the relevant variable. What we can do, what we have the capacity to do, is to do cross-cultural comparisons and to see what's distinctive about the West at the particular moment that modern science emerges, which is essentially during the 16th and 17th centuries. What we know is that we have scientific culture in ancient Greece, We have a scientific culture in medieval Islam, and we have a scientific culture in China. The distinctive thing about the scientific cultures of these periods is that they undergo what we might call a boom-bust pattern, that we see an efflorescence of scientific activity, but that scientific activity does not consolidate. What we see in the West, by way of contrast, is not merely an efflorescence of scientific activity in the 17th century, but we get a consolidation of scientific activity, and indeed the model of scientific knowledge moves to the centre of our culture as the way to acquire knowledge. In other words, our cognitive values are essentially the values that are associated with modern science, and that does not happen in any other culture. So I suppose what I'm saying here is that part of what we're attempting to explain when we talk about science emerging in the West is not merely the factors that gave rise to science, but the factors that lead to its consolidation, in contrast to the boom-bust patterns that we see in other cultures. And this takes me to what will essentially be the last of those points. How is it that science is legitimated in Western society? Where does its legitimation come from? And my suggestion will be it comes from values that are inherent in the Western Christian tradition. Okay, so just to step back a bit, we're talking not merely about the emergence of science, but what makes it persist and what moves it to the centre of our culture. And part of the answer to that question is it's to do with a set of values that give it social legitimacy and give it this ongoing drive, as it were. Now, there is another way we can think about this question of the emergence of science. It's somewhat less reputable, but we can think counterfactually about alternative histories. And just to give you a fictional example, some of you might know this book, the trilogy by Philip Pullman, His Dark Materials. There was a movie made called The Golden Compass. But one of the premises of this fictional work is that the Protestant Reformation never happened. Okay? Now, part of my argument is that the Protestant Reformation is actually a key part of what made modern science possible. So here we have an interesting counterfactual. No Protestant Reformation. Does science happen in this fictional account? Well, yes, it does happen, but the science they have is not our science, okay? It's a different kind of science. And for those of you who've seen the relevant movie, these are the kinds of technologies that you get in a world in which the Protestant Reformation never took place. Now, I admit that this is a kind of speculative approach to things, and I'm not pinning too much on it in terms of the sorts of claims I would make. But I think what it shows us is that there are historical contingencies, or to put it another way, there's nothing inevitable about the particular trajectory that the modern West has taken. It might have turned out differently, and these counterfactual examples give us creative ways of thinking about what the world might have been like had certain things not happened. Now, it's important to contrast that with an alternative view, which I think characterises this very popular notion of a perennial conflict between science and religion. And let me give you an example of what that would look like. So here we have a graph from the website nobeliefs.com. I think the clue is in the title. And you can see, here's the idea that science is going along very nicely with the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Romans. Then Christianity comes along and kills it dead. And it's really only in the modern period that we can get science up and running again. Now, this is not a terribly sophisticated graph. I don't know what the units of scientific advancement are on the y-axis. But I put it up there because it actually presents us with what I think is a fairly common view, and that is the view that the development of something like our modern science is kind of inevitable unless something stops it, okay? And what I'm going to try and persuade you of today is that it's completely opposite in a way. that the emergence of modern science is something very special and odd in a way. And so what calls for explanation is not what kills science off, but what makes it possible, okay? But as I say, this tends to be an underpinning assumption of a lot of those who are subscribed to this notion of an enduring conflict between science and religion. My view, and I won't develop this in any depth tonight, is that while the common view is here, for example, that science really gets up and running when it gets out from under the control of religion and theology. In fact, something like the opposite was the case, that natural philosophy or science and theology were relatively distinct in the Middle Ages, and it's their coming together in the early modern period, in the 16th and 17th centuries, that makes modern science possible. Okay, now that's overstating it somewhat, but that, in a sense, it's the opposite to the kind of picture you see there. So I'm going to come back to the construction of the conflict myth, but let me just give you a couple more instances of it. This is going back some time. This is the original cosmos by the scientist, the cosmologist Carl Sagan. But you can see in his historical account, starting at the top and working down, he's got the same kind of thing, that you've got this enormous gap in history where nothing of interest happened. What's going on in that gap is that Christianity is sort of in the driving seat in the Latin West. And so you don't get any science between Ptolemy and Copernicus on this account, right? But that's a fairly common view where, we can call it the gap view. And indeed, we see precisely this in the more recent version of Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And so when Newton comes along, no reference to Newton's theological commitments. Rather, what Newton represents is when rationality conquers, overcomes a medieval period of fear and superstition. So these notions, these false notions of history, are very common in popular presentations of the history of science. I hasten to add, not by historians of science, but often by professional popularisers of science. And one last example along the same theme, as we could expect, here's the idea that what you've got with religion and science are two systems competing for the same explanatory territory. And then the historical thesis of progress, that progress consists in science winning that competitive battle for providing explanations for the same kind of phenomenon. So Richard Dawkins presents us here with what's essentially a historical thesis about science and religion competing to do the same kind of stuff. Science does it a lot better. And so there's a kind of inevitability, given that view of things, to the triumph of science over religion and theology. Okay, well, what really happened? I'm going to talk then about these ways in which religion has an impact on the historical emergence of Western science in the 16th and 17th centuries, what we typically refer to as the scientific revolution. And the first of these is motivations, and I'm not going to talk much about this. It's fairly straightforward, and the basic story is that the key actors, many of the key actors in the scientific revolution, were motivated by theological or religious considerations, okay? And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. But Johannes Kepler, who formulated the three laws of planetary motion that Isaac Newton subsequently reduced to one, the universal law of gravitation, a key figure in the emergence of modern science. But Kepler tells us that he originally wanted to be a theologian, but now understands that astronomy is a kind of sacred activity, a sacred calling, as it were. Part of the background, I won't talk about this in detail here, is a new Protestant conception of vocation, the sanctity of mundane vocations, and this will apply then to the scientific enterprise, and so scientific pursuits can be regarded as kind of sacred pursuits, if you like. Robert Boyle, a key figure in the emergence of experimental philosophy or experimental science, says something very similar, that showing other people the perfections of God in nature is a priestly activity. So Boyle referred to scientists, or natural philosophers as they were called in those days, as he calls them priests of nature. So again, science there's a priestly vocation. Okay, so these individuals, not only are they motivated by religious considerations to pursue the study of nature, but they also construct the study of nature as an inherently religious enterprise. And I think part of the story is a new Protestant conception of vocation, but that's only part of the story, because you'll see similar sets of motivations in Catholic thinkers as well. Now, I said I wasn't going to talk about that for very long because it's relatively straightforward. Not every key figure in this period will be as explicit as this, and some people were a bit shy about, Descartes, for example, was always a bit nervous about making any kinds of religious claims, although his religious convictions, I think, are quite clear. But these guys are clear about the fact that they're motivated to the pursuit of scientific activity by their religious convictions. The second thing I want to talk about is the presuppositions that make modern science possible. And one of the key ones is the notion of laws of nature. And cutting a very long story short, prior to the 17th century, people understood that nature had its regularities and that natural philosophy or science was the way in which we provide an account of those regularities, typically in terms of causation. The most dominant explanation of how causes happened in the natural world is that there were causes embedded in natural things, and these inherent causes, these inherent properties, powers, and virtues, once you understood those, you understood how the world worked. And what happened in the 17th century is that natural things had those powers removed from them. They became completely inert. Nature was understood to be comprised or made up of inert particles that were moved according to laws, and the source of their motion was, in fact, God. And Descartes is the person who makes this claim most explicitly, and I'll come to him in a moment. But let me just go to Kepler, who we've encountered already. And Kepler is the guy who discovers the three laws of planetary motion, although he doesn't put it that way. But what he discovers is that the motions in the heavens can be described according to mathematical laws. And this is a very new thing, an introduction of mathematical description along the basis of laws. And as I'm sure all of you know, Kepler's laws are, one, that the planets move in elliptical orbits, not circular orbits, but elliptical orbits, with the sun at one of the foci of the ellipse. The second law, if you look at the diagram, A1 equals A2. And what I mean by that is that the area under the curve traced out equal areas in equal times. So the planets go faster when they're closer to the sun, and that has a particular mathematical relation in terms of, as Kepler described it, the area under the curve. And the third law is the square of the period is proportional to the cube of the distance from the sun. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because it's astonishing in a way that objects in the heavens conform to these mathematical laws. And Kepler's argument was that the reason they do that is that God is a mathematician and that he's instantiated these laws. And on that basis, we know that the laws can be mathematical and that they're eternal and immutable. But as I've said, Descartes is the person who states this most explicitly. And here in his Principles of Philosophy, where Descartes lays out his Copernican science, he explains where motion comes from. And it's not inherent in the particles that make up the world. Rather, God imparts motion to things when he first created them, and he maintains through his continuous creation that motion in objects. And Descartes will say he does this in a lawful fashion. For Descartes then, when an object is in motion, in essence, what is going on is that God is successively recreating that object in different successive parts of space, okay? So every motion is directly attributable to God's will, okay? Motion follows laws. Why? Because God is a lawgiver, and when God wills something, he does it in a lawful way. And the laws of nature are eternal, immutable, and apply everywhere because these are characteristics of the divine lawgiver himself. So for Descartes, the laws of nature have a theological foundation. And remember, prior to this, we have understandings of the regularities of the world, but they're not understood in terms of immutable mathematical laws. And these immutable mathematical laws have a theological foundation. So that's Descartes. Now, in Philosophy 101, they'll tell you, not entirely incorrectly, that Descartes' a rationalist and we've got the empiricists over the channel in England doing something quite different. This is something they all agreed on. There are laws of nature that originate from the divine will. So here's Robert Boyle stating it explicitly. Laws of nature are not inherent in things. The causal properties are not in things. They're imposed on things by God, and they depend on his will. Okay? Moving on. Samuel Clarke, who you may not be familiar with, but Newton and Leibniz had a big squabble about who invented the calculus, and it turned into a squabble about many other things. Leibniz was not happy with the Newtonian conception of the universe, and Samuel Clarke was the guy who took up cudgels on Newton's behalf. And there's a very famous correspondence between the philosopher Leibniz and Samuel Clarke. And Samuel Clarke, I think, is probably the most sophisticated philosophical theologian of the 18th century. That's a big claim, but let's say in England, okay? That makes it a bit easier to get up and running, I think. But anyway, so here's, again, pretty clear statement of what's going on in nature. The course of nature is nothing else but the arbitrary will and pleasure of God exerting itself on matter continually. So similar kind of thing to what Darwin was saying. What is nature? It's not actually inherent in the stuff. It's actually God doing all the work. And when we study the natural world, we're studying what God has willed in nature. And that's why we find these eternal, immutable mathematical principles, unchanging. And okay, the guy who kind of wraps up the whole thing, Isaac Newton, the business of philosophy, and he means here natural philosophy, which is for us, science, okay, is to find out what the laws are that God chose to instantiate in this world. And when he puts this little rider on the end, not the ones he might have done had he so pleased, we can imagine that God could have come up with a whole range of possible laws to make nature operate. And this, I think, is actually an anti-Cartesian statement here. What Newton is saying, in order to find out what laws God has instantiated in the world, we actually need to do the empirical research to discover what God has willed for the operations of matter. That notwithstanding, Newton was perfectly happy to accept Descartes' first law of motion, for example. So summing up this part of the story, which I think is a key part, the presuppositions of modern science that assume that there are laws of nature that we can discover. Not summing it up, sorry, I'm doing PowerPoint karaoke here. This was a bit of a surprise. But anyway, let me tell you why John Herschel is there. This view of laws of nature persisted into the 19th century, right? So it starts in the 17th century. We still have people saying precisely this in the 19th century. John Herschel is probably the most respected, we'd say, philosopher of science these days. And this work, the Preliminary Discourse, was regarded as the state-of-the-art account of modern science. And you can see that Herschel is still running this line that what laws of nature are divine volitions that we can study. And just to hammer the point home, William Whewell, another pinnacle of the scientific establishment, says exactly the same thing. When we study the natural world, what we're studying are the laws of nature. In essence, we're studying what, as I say, what God has imposed on the natural world. Okay. Moving on, methods. Now, this is a hard one to put across. Okay, so if you don't get it, don't worry. Trust me, the methods of the modern sciences are very much informed by theological considerations. And if you read this book, you'll get the full story. But let me give it to you in what I think is a relatively understandable and palatable way. Again, if we go back to the standard Aristotelian view, and Aristotle's science dominated the university arts curriculum essentially from the 13th century through to the 17th, and indeed for much of the 17th century, Aristotle's textbooks were how people understood how the world operated. And as I've said before, part of this Aristotelian story was that things have their inherent properties on the basis of which we understand what's going on in the natural world. But the other thing Aristotle thought was that as human beings were rational animals who were naturally oriented towards finding the truth, okay? So that if you developed the right set of intellectual virtues, you were pretty much guaranteed that you'd get reliable knowledge of the natural world, okay? Because as human beings, we were naturally oriented, teleologically ordered, as it were, towards arriving at knowledge, okay? So that's the view. What 17th century thinkers did, and particularly those who relied on the theological anthropology of Augustine, and this was initially the Protestant reformers, but not only the Protestant reformers, they made the point that human nature was so corrupted that we could not easily discover what was going on in the natural world. So the point that Calvin is making here is that philosophers like Aristotle knew nothing about original sin, and because of this, they were far too optimistic in what their estimations of human knowledge, what we could accomplish as human beings, right? And this is Calvin's famous notion of the total corruption, and what he actually means by this is it's not so much the grade of deprivation, but the fact that it applies to every part of human beings. It's not just a moral loss, right, deprivation. Actually, our epistemic capacities are also affected by the fall. So that means if you know that, you can't have the sanguine optimistic view that Aristotle has. This is, oh, well, we're naturally oriented towards knowledge of nature. If we do the right things, we will know how the natural world operates, okay? So the theological anthropology leads you to be a little bit more sceptical about our prospects for a veridical knowledge of the world. And just to throw his partner in crime in here, Martin Luther says the same thing, okay? Straightforward. It's impossible that we could know nature after the fall of Adam, okay? Because our minds were perverted. So the story of the fall, in its full Augustinian weight, has this capacity to make us think, well, hang on a minute, maybe knowledge acquisition is not as easy as Aristotle would have us believe. Now, of course, these guys didn't go on to be great scientists. So this is partly a story about unintended consequences. Neither was this view exclusively that of Protestant thinkers, because we have the fans of, we're doing the PowerPoint karaoke. Just forget that slide. I was going to talk very briefly about Pascal, who is also, as a Jansenist Catholic, very much committed to an Augustinian way of things. And what Pascal says in his famous Pensées, what you see in the ancients is they either overestimate what we can know about the natural world, and that's Aristotle and the gang, or they're completely pessimistic about it, and that's the skeptics. And what you need to do, he says, is you've got to steer a path between the confidence of the Aristotelians and the pessimism of the skeptics. And that, for Pascal, is the experimental science. Okay, let me give you one. Well, this is really the kind of smoking gun. Given all I've said, well, how does this, bottom line, when the rubber hits the road, how do you arrive at knowledge of nature? Well, what you expect is you expect a partial knowledge. You have to look at little bits of things. You have to investigate knowledge aggressively because the natural world itself has fallen. You have to have lots of people involved. You don't just read Aristotle. Science is therefore a collective enterprise. It's a cumulative enterprise. It takes generations and generations working on tiny problems to actually make a little bit of progress. That's really the bottom line. And Robert Hooke, who along with Newton comes up with the inverse square law that then gives rise to the universal law of gravitation. Very important guy. This book is a terrific book with wonderful drawings that Hooke came up with through his microscope. But right at the outset, Hooke kind of gives us the smoking gun to this whole story about how theological anthropology impacts on the emergence of an experimental approach. And as he says here, every person has an innate corruption, and that leads us to make mistakes when we attempt to arrive at reliable knowledge. These are the dangers in the processes of human reasoning, and the remedy for this is the mechanical experimental philosophy, which is to say the new science is a way, or is a kind of palliative for the epistemic impacts of original sin. Okay, so you can't get around this thing completely, but you can partially address the impacts of the fall on our cognitive capacities by doing science in this new way, this experimental way, says Hooke. So let me just sum up. I've already given you an indication of the aspects, of the elements of an experimental approach to the natural world that seek to address this explicitly, but let me enumerate them again. For Aristotle, scientific knowledge was demonstrable. Okay, it was kind of logically true. Here, what you get with an experimental approach is knowledge that's only probabilistic and partial. Okay, you don't get knowledge of the essences of things, which is what Aristotle attempted. You just have knowledge of the appearances of things. Okay, not really a deep causal knowledge of what's going on. As we said before, knowledge is corporate and cumulative. This is a very distinctive feature of the science that we see in the West. You need lots of people doing it, and you need to do it over a long period of time. That takes a major investment. It's experimental rather than speculative. And this, let's just quickly, if you go back to the Philosophy 101, you know, continental rationalists and British empiricists is the story you get there. And this story is told essentially by, I think, by Kantian historians of philosophy, and then say, well, Kant actually solved, you bring them both together and you end up with Kant, right? Anyway, but the truth to that distinction is actually this. If you look at what the historical actors are talking about, they don't talk about rationalist empiricism, they talk about speculative philosophy and experimental philosophy. That's the distinction of the period. That's how they think about the distinction. And this approach, the experimental approach, is contrasted to the speculative approach. And just by the way, it's very interesting, that terminology actually comes across from a religious context. So experimental, if you look at the uses of experimental in the 17th century, there are a lot of uses in the religious context: experimental religious, experimental prayer, experimental reading of scripture, as opposed to speculative religion, which is a religion of books and theologians. And that distinction gets mapped across into philosophy, and experimental philosophy is then contrasted, where you get down and you get dirty, with the philosophy of books, where you just read it in Aristotle, and that's good enough. Okay, so that's an important distinction. The justification for using the microscope and the telescope is that Adam had telescopic vision and microscopic vision in his original perfection. And so the instruments are a way of regaining some of those Adamic encyclopedic capacities. Because nature itself has fallen, this then becomes a justification for an intrusive experimental approach, again, which was very new. The prevailing view had been, if you mess with nature, you're actually changing it. And what you're studying is not nature anymore. You're studying violent motion, or you're studying something that's artificial. That was the Aristotelian view, okay? But now with this notion that nature has actually fallen out of its original condition, it's this intrusive approach that we use to investigate the natural world. And again, it's justified by the notion that nature itself is in a fallen condition. Last one. So overall, summing up, the whole of the experimental method then is a kind of therapeutic regimen that's applied to overcome the cognitive impact of original sin. And so theological anthropology is an important underpinning to the justifications for this new way of doing experiments. Okay, last one. The last one in terms of modes of religious influence, a social and moral legitimation. And it's important to understand, I think, before we go down this path, that when you get something new, it's going to be suspect. And if you look at attitudes to the new sciences, perhaps the most famous example of negative attitude to the new sciences is Jonathan Swift's savage satire on the Royal Society in Gulliver's Travels, where he has this satirical story about all of the crazy experiments that are going on, most of which are modelled on, directly modelled on experiments that were conducted by the Royal Society. But in the 16th century, this new approach was ridiculed widely in the literature, in plays, in sermons, because it was regarded as an undignified way of doing philosophy. So science needs moral legitimation. It needs social legitimation. And as I've said, the distinctive thing about the emergence of science in the West is not just its emergence, but its consolidation, and the fact that in the West we don't get this boom-bust pattern. And that's a story then that's to do with legitimation. And my argument will be that religious considerations are important in that process. So let me just give you the bird's eye view from the 19th century. Here's Macaulay. And what Macaulay says, the problem of the philosophical approaches, which is to say the scientific approaches prior to the 17th century, and this key figure of Francis Bacon, is that what philosophy essentially was about before this was moral perfection, the formation of the individual. It was the ethics was the main focus, right? And according to Macaulay, what Bacon does is he grabs philosophy, natural philosophy, gives it a good shake and says, forget about moral perfection. We need to focus on the material welfare of human beings, okay? Now, what's interesting here is that Macaulay seems to think it's obvious that this is the way to go. I'm not sure that it is obvious, and certainly to the historical actors in the 17th century, it wasn't obvious that an activity dedicated to moral formation was less important than looking to the practical needs of welfare on a kind of mass scale. Now, it's not necessarily an either or, you might say, but there's a sense in which the success of science is predicated on there being a loser, and the loser is something like, again, overstating it, the humanities, or things that focus on questions of meaning and value, okay? And what Macaulay's suggesting is that that's all very well, but the most important stuff is the stuff that focuses on human welfare. Now, again, part of my argument is that there's actually going to be a theological justification for this kind of Baconian move to focus on utility and to focus on progress in the sense of material welfare. So here's again the clear Baconian statement that vindicates this judgment from Macaulay in the 19th century. What's the purpose of seeking knowledge? It's not for the quiet of resolution. It's not for contemplation, right? It's not about personal moral formation, but to reinvest the sovereignty and power that human beings had in their first state of the creation. And he's referring back here to Adam's dominion over nature, a dominion over nature that was lost as a consequence of the fall. So again, this notion of the fall and this Augustinian re-emphasis on the fall and its consequences is manifested in the justifications of the pursuit of science. And to give you the long version from Bacon, I apologise for the long quote, but this really sets it out very clearly, I think. What happens in the fall is that human beings not merely fall from their moral innocence, they lose their capacity to dominate creation. But in this life, we can partially recover both of those. The function of religion is to re-establish our moral control to some extent, right? To help us overcome our moral limitations that inevitably result from the fall. But the purpose of the sciences is to help re-establish that literal dominion over the natural world that Adam once enjoyed, okay? So science is a partner with religion in an overarching redemptive enterprise that is addressed to these two aspects of human nature, the moral and this literal physical dominion over the natural world. Okay? I'll give you one more before we talk about the myth construction. So in addition to the fall story, and we've already seen this in the questions of what is it that's motivating the historical actors, we get the idea that the study of nature is an inherently religious enterprise. And there we have Robert Boyle. As we've already alluded to, the study of nature is essentially something that can promote religion in this way. So that then becomes another way in which we get a religious legitimation of this new enterprise. It's something it's just as religious as this business of moral formation, study of the natural world, okay? And then Newton, in this masterwork, the Principia, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, he says what we see through our studies of the natural world, we see the work of God as an intelligent agent. And so Newton will go on to say that God is incorporated in study of the natural world, which is to say, or natural philosophy. You say, talk of God is necessarily part of natural philosophy, or as we would say, science. Okay, so that's wrapping up these four aspects of why I think religious considerations are so important in the emergence and persistence and consolidation of modern science. Very quickly, how do we get the story of conflict then? Where does that come from? Essentially, I think it comes from a Protestant critique of Catholics that's universalized to religion, and Enlightenment philosophes like Condorcet develop a theory of progress in which religion is necessarily replaced by science. It's explicit in Auguste Comte's version of the stages of knowledge that naturally progress from the theological to the scientific. So again, positivist philosopher of the Enlightenment period. And we see this coalescing in 19th century post-Darwinian stories of people like Thomas Henry Huxley. And Huxley wants to argue that now we have this perennial battle between science and religion. And part of the way in which this trick is done is that the theological laws of nature are simply redescribed as laws of nature, right? And God is just taken out of the picture, and laws of nature are taken to be brute features of the natural world, and ironically, as features of the natural world that somehow prop up a naturalistic understanding of the world. Two more figures who those of you familiar with the history of science will know very well. These two very popular works, John Draper's The Conflict of Religion and Science, and Andrew Dixon's White History of the Warfare of Science with Theology. These are the guys who plug in particular historical examples to this long-standing myth story. And these books are enormously popular. They were reproduced in many languages, and curiously, you'll still encounter people like the evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne, citing these guys as if they were models of historical acumen, which I can assure you they are not. Nonetheless, they managed to author a myth that has sort of deeply embedded itself in our conceptions of what it is to be truly modern. And I think I might stop there and we'll have some Q&A.
Yeah, so I'm afraid you'll be speaking to my students tomorrow, so I'm glad that'll be having you. And first, I wanted to thank you. So I appreciate your laying out the theological background of Descartes. I'm something of a Descartes apologist myself, and so I like to see that. My main question is this. So just to put my cards a little on the table, I'm a Aristotelian Platonist, and I was smarting, perhaps understandably, a little bit, being hit with all these quotes by these mechanists, and one after another, because in the ancient Aristotle, Plato world, mechanism, atomism, Lucretius, Democritus, these are the enemies of God and religion, right? These are the anti-theology thinkers, right? The idea that, if you just have the positions and memento of things, you can predict everything. This is very bad for theology from our perspective, right? And that's it seems because once you adopt that picture, God really is kind of something it would be natural to take out, right? Like the idea that, well, this is all just kind of like a clock, and one piece contacting another leads to something else, and this can explain everything we see physically. It takes the magic out of the universe, right? There's no teleology. There's not a hierarchy of being. The world's not like a cosmos or even a God anymore. It's something that could almost work on its own. It would be natural to take God out of this picture. So, why so you've kind of been addressing, I think, critiques from, let's call it the intellectual left. What about from the right, who would say that this mechanistic picture is actually it is naturally kind of anti-theological, and it'd be natural to take it out?
Yeah, quite. So two things. I think, first of all, so the question is, what was appealing about essentially an Epicurean matter theory to these guys who were very theologically invested? So that's one of the story. That's part of the story. But to come back to your second part, I think you're exactly right that this understanding of nature is definitely a hostage to fortune. So it's interesting that the Platonically inclined thinkers, the Cambridge Platonists in the 17th century, are very worried that Cartesianism lends itself to a rewriting in terms of a purely naturalistic approach. And they were prophetic, because in the 19th century, that's precisely what happened, that you simply get a redescription of mechanistic laws of nature in purely naturalistic terms. Now, arguably, what you don't get is you don't get the theological underpinning that would make it rational to think that way. Okay, that's my own view. But to go back to the question of, well, why is what makes it attractive? I think it's the fact that first of all, you've got a deep commitment to theological voluntarism, which Michael has written about at length as a key part of what constitutes modernity. And this commitment to so it's their desire to attribute to God, to attribute to the divine will and stress the divine will. It meshes very neatly with that. And there are precedents for this in the Islamic tradition, where you've got this combination of occasionalism and atomism. And so it's appealing because although God is absent from the Epicurean version, you can slot a God into it very easily, I think, and which is to say it's a blank canvas on which you can just project your voluntarist God. And that I think works very well. So I'm not necessarily advocating it, but it's understandable to me why Epicureanism would be appealing, because I think the argument was that the God you've got in the Aristotelian natural philosophy is not consistent with the Christian God, and that the scholastics had kind of made a mistake there. So that was the kind of assumption, I think.
Thank you very much for this presentation. In pushing back gently and carefully as you did against the sort of antinomian construal of science and religion, naturally, perhaps inevitably, focus on 17th century materials, just as those who advocate that position tend to. Now, it strikes me that in listening to your presentation, that what we see here is really in some ways a particular turn and sort of a consolidation of a natural theology, which has this peculiar effect over time that where for a while, including in Descartes, God is still very firmly presented as the source of the world that science then in its own expansive and successive ways seeks to describe. Over time, that the very nature of that God shifts from being the source to becoming an inference. And at the moment of that, then probably there is a sort of a loss of interest in the theological dimension altogether, because why talk about primary causes when it's really all about secondary? What makes me then wonder is to what extent another term wouldn't have to be introduced, one with which scientific inquiry, even after it begins to treat and eventually dismiss God merely as an inference, still has to contend, which is the principle of God understood as logos rather than as a kind of voluntaristic power. After all, any scientific enterprise can only get underway by stipulating from the outset as an assumption and an axiom that whatever particulars it investigates must be potentially intelligible. Otherwise the project could hardly get underway. This that the cosmos is potentially intelligible is the very precondition of any scientific endeavor. And that's a metaphysical assumption. It doesn't necessarily have to be cashed out as a theological assumption. So that's why my question would be then, what is, might it not be necessary to sort of further inflect the account by showing crit that ultimately neither theology nor science can truly dispense is a metaphysical conception of logos?
Yeah, I find that attractive with it. Yeah, to go back to your point, I mean, I think one of the important points you made was that the fact that God goes from being the kind of axiomatic foundation to then being an inference, and you know, it was stated, you know, ironically, by one of the critics of these versions of natural theology, that no one thought to doubt the existence of God until the Boyle lecturers sought to prove it using the sciences. And look, I think that's exactly right, because the kind of God you get as a consequence of this use of natural theology for these kinds of purposes is a God who is susceptible to a particular kind of critique subsequently then. And I think, as you rightly put it, the notion of God is a kind of implication of our sciences. Yeah, look, the question of logos is a really interesting one, and the intelligibility of the universe, which is also relevant to this question about the, you know, Wegener's thing about the math of, you know, why is the universe not merely intelligible, but why is it mathematically intelligible, which it seems to be. But the question, but you know, the question of God as logos is interestingly largely absent from the figures that I look at, except for now, as I mentioned, the Cambridge Platonists, for example, are very simple. So there's this Platonic tradition that's very sympathetic to those kinds of notions and worried about where this mechanistic science will head, and in some sense prophetic in that regard, I think. And then the interesting question, I think, is whether, given the state of the modern sciences, there's any possible way of recovering an alternative, latent alternatives that were there in the history that still rely on the intelligibility, but don't have the, you know, the other great problem with this is this, the exploitation of nature stuff, which I think directly comes out of this mechanistic view of the world and the notion of human dominion. You put those things together, you've got the recipe for, the environmental destruction of the world, in essence. So it's, yeah.
Go to Michael Gillespie, and after that, there's an undergraduate. We'll take an undergraduate. Peter, a really wonderful talk. Is this a question that arose for me after reading a piece that Locke wrote, written shortly after 1700? Locke is a good friend of Boyle's and Newton's, and it's just on the universe. And he wrote for one of his treatises. He imagines the universe is approximately what we would say 8 light years across. So, you know, he knew Huygens, he knew, so he had a pretty capacious view of the universe, but of course much smaller than the universe. And in his discussions of this, he adopts exactly the kind of position that, you know, God is directing everything. He's made this all happen. But he stops at one point and says, there are people that imagine this universe might have come into being by particles just bumping into one another. Right? And he says, but you know, there wasn't enough time. The universe is only 6,000 years old. And therefore, that theory can't be correct. Of course, the science that he and Boyle and others propagated would go on to prove that the universe was way older than they imagined. And it then became conceivable from a scientific point of view that maybe it was just particles bumping into one another. And I think that's, in a certain sense, where science is today. So we believe in laws of nature. We hope we can find them someday. But we keep discovering that those particles are not doing exactly all the things that we think they are. So I wonder whether the breakdown of that theological foundation for science isn't one of the reasons for the way that we see science versus religion today, religion as a form of science.
Yeah, no, really interesting. I'm not aware of the Locke quote, although Locke interestingly does stress our epistemic limits as part of what's the justification for his epistemological project. And just to give another example of the time problem, you know, one of the objections to Darwinism was that there wasn't enough time for these random processes to get up and running. And Lord Kelvin, the kind of one of the progenitors of thermodynamics, had done the maths on this. Said the world's only 20 million years old, Charles Darwin. You haven't got enough time for all of this stuff to happen. But as we know, his calculations were not based on. He hadn't factored in the radioactive activity in the Earth's core. Anyway, long story short, yeah, given enough time, the argument is it's the monkeys and the typewriters, right? That, you know, But I nonetheless think you've still got Thomas's question about the intelligibility. Is it where, you know, how does intelligibility get in? You know, where does it get in? And then the same is true for us as you know, the products of evolution. You know, as we're the product of random evolution. You know, what would make us think that we could detect intelligibility anyway?
I agree entirely, and I think that it is a kind of carryover from Christianity. The question is whether the universe is intelligible, whether it is intelligible, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, and maybe it isn't. And then what you've got with the sciences is this instrumental layover that enables us to do kinds of things, but it doesn't necessarily mean we've actually got to some deep level of intelligibility. Yeah.
Undergraduate, please. Tell us your name.
Hi, my name is Casey. Thank you for this talk. I thought it's very interesting. So I wanted to ask why specifically there was the 1,000-year sort of slowdown in scientific discovery. I mean, you've very nicely laid out the sort of foundations for the science we've seen in the modern period from 16th century or so on. But, you know, if that very crude picture that you showed earlier has any sort of truth to it, which it seems to me that it does seem there was some fair bits of science being done in ancient times and ancient societies, and it does seem that, like, if it didn't slow down, it at least did not grow with any of the Christian dominion before the Protestant Revolution in those 1,000 years. And I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit about why there was so little development in that period.
Yeah, look, that's a good question, Casey. And let me say, I mean, it also gives me the opportunity to say that the factors that are going to cause the promotion or the stagnation of scientific activity are not merely to do with sets of ideas. Okay, there are going to be a whole range of practical considerations that I haven't even mentioned that are going to be relevant variables for this. So, if your culture is falling apart, you're not going to be able to do a lot of scientific activity or great art, for example, if you've got the barbarian hordes at the gates. So there are a whole range of causal factors, and I've just considered a number of those. And those material factors, I think, are relevant considerations also for the boom-bust patterns of Islam. What happens to Greek science, what happens to Islamic science. It's not purely to do with questions of legitimation and ideas themselves. But look, I would say two things. First of all, it's important not to project back our science on what the Greeks are up to and on what because Greek science is integrated into the philosophical enterprise, and the philosophical enterprise is very much aimed at moral formation or spiritual exercises, to overstate it somewhat. So these insofar as the Epicureans, for example, are interested in science, they're interested in it because of what it can do for them as individuals, right? So we shouldn't equate so-called Greek science with the sort of scientific activities that we've got going on in faculties around this university, for example. So it's a mistake. I think it's a mistake to think that. And this really goes to, again, what's distinctive about 17th century science is actually a moving away from that. Okay, and once you understand that, then it's not as if nothing's going on in Middle Ages. There's lots of interesting stuff going on in the Middle Ages. There's lots of interesting science going on. You've got lots of Islamic scholars doing terrific science and making significant progress over what the Greeks had done. So the two things I'd say is, well, three things. First of all, it's useful to think about there are material factors that play in that I haven't really talked about. So that's a good point to make, I think. Secondly, don't equate Greek science with what we think of science. And thirdly, there's lots of intellectual activity going on in the Middle Ages. So the Dark Ages is really a significant misnomer. Having said all of which, I do think there's something to the notion of a scientific revolution. So, medieval historians of science often get very cross about this, because they think, no, actually, you got to take the science that's going on. You've got to take that science seriously, and they're right about that. But it's not, to quote Star Trek, it's not science as we know it, Jim. Right? It's another activity. And so it's a very change in the conception of what counts as science as part of the scientific revolution.
Keely, you want to ask a question?
Yes. This actually plays into this last question. Actually, it's about science during the Middle Ages. So, yeah, in the presentation, I think very convincingly there was just an association of the need for more rigorous methods, but also, technology instruments due to the darkening of our intellect and of nature itself for the fall of man. Right? But there were figures in the Middle Ages that had a similar ethos. I'm thinking of Roger Bacon especially, both on the theological and the scientific side. He says that, science comes from experience, right? Especially in the exact mathematical sciences, optics. And he also has a very, I would say, almost novel form of theology for his time, the 13th century, in which mystical experience and also our experience of languages, like philological readings of the Bible, comes into play. And he's a Franciscan, but to my knowledge has not really an extraordinary or strange or quasi-Protestant view on the fall of man, on original sin at all, right? And of course, there's also the Oxford calculators, many of which were nominalists, and nominalists had the least sort of severe view on original sin out of everyone in the Middle Ages. They thought the consequences of the fall was the lightest out of anyone. But then there their sort of empirical, mathematical, physical works, like it plays directly into Newton. I definitely read them. So like this group of medieval, empiricists who did not have a strong view on original sin, like what place do they have in this narrative?
Well, as you can tell, not much of a place. And I think if your implication is that perhaps they should. Yeah, look, Roger Bacon, you're right. In fact, Roger Bacon is the guy who actually first used the first expression, experimental science, I think, is in Roger Bacon, and he does stress the importance of experience. But look, so does Aristotle. Aristotle's an empiricist. But Aristotle's science is empiricist, but it's based on our common sense observations of the world. But for the 17th century, they were undisciplined and general and leapt too quickly to generalizations, and that was the view. So look, part of the story here is to do with the status of the mathematical sciences like optics and astronomy, and how they differ from something like natural philosophy. And look, I can't give you a satisfactory answer to the question, but I would say this though, that one of the signal accomplishments of the 17th century revolution was to bring together a disparate range of sciences, including optics and astronomy, which were mathematical, and natural philosophy, which was causal, and to unite these in a single kind of activity. And the symbol of that is Newton's own masterwork, which talks about the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, which in an Aristotelian understanding of things was not possible, because mathematics of the speculative sciences, theology, mathematics, natural philosophy, and you don't transgress the boundaries of those kinds of disciplines, except for the secondary subordinate sciences. So there's a story about how the traditional classifications of the sciences are overthrown in the 17th century, and that's for me at least the major accomplishment.
Okay, last question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question regarding what seemed like, it seemed that there are times in the talks where there are some things that pertain a bit more to the realm of technology and others that pertain more to the realm of science. For example, the Macaulay quote that sort of justified science by it being able to do good for moral good for people. Compare that with the quotes that you cited from Boyle and Newton that seem to focus more on the contemplation aspect of it. And it seems to me that there's an important distinction there, because technology seems to be developed or invented, right? And you gave the example of from the Golden Compass. There's lots of different ways that you can sort of fly people and transport them. You can have airships that look one way versus another, versus airplanes or helicopters. Whereas it seems that science is much more discovered, right? Excluding, different formulations of theories, it's still there's this idea of a fundamental truth that is being reached towards, that kind of is absent when it comes to develop or tinkering with things. And I was wondering if that's a distinction that exists in the medieval mind or in the pre-medieval mind, or stepping into the Renaissance Enlightenment mind. If that's an important or useful distinction to have, and if there were different understandings of how then each of those.
Yeah, look, I didn't talk much about technology, and you're right, it is an important part of the story. I'm not sure you can shed too much light on this, beyond saying that my focus is really on the natural philosophy side rather than the technology side. But look, if we go to the question of the question of human welfare, the more relevant consideration, I think, is probably actually medicine rather than technology. And again, medicine wasn't part of the story, but for people like Descartes, medicine and the potential things you could accomplish through medical advance
associated with theoretical advance. These were really important and again related this notion of ministering to the welfare of the human race. So just in answer to your question, how technology relates to that, yeah, it's part of it, but certainly for my historical actors, that they were more interested in medicine per se as the agent for the practical, for improving the lives of human beings. You know, one of the things at any rate.
So thank you very much, Peter Harrison.